The late afternoon sun cast long golden rays over the rolling hills of Tennessee, draping the porch of Dolly Parton's home in a soft glow. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle, mingling with the faint aroma of fresh-cut grass, the kind of evening that felt almost sacred in its stillness. Yet, for all its beauty, the silence felt heavier than usual. The rocking chair beside her sat motionless, untouched, its absence louder than any sound. She wrapped her fingers around a glass of sweet tea, condensation trailing down the sides, leaving damp imprints on her palm. It had been a ritual for so many years, her and Carl, sitting side by side, watching the world slow down in the quiet of the evening. Now, the space beside her felt vast, an emptiness that no melody could fill. The wind stirred lazily, rustling the magnolia trees at the edge of the yard, whispering secrets only she could hear. A stack of letters rested on the small table next to her, the topmost envelope already torn open. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, each word chosen with a tenderness that suggested the writer understood grief well. It was from a fan, a woman who had also lost the love of her life. She asked how Dolly stayed strong, how she kept going when the love of her world was no longer there to hold her hand. She let the letter rest on her lap, her fingers tracing the ink as her thoughts drifted. She had been asked this before, countless times, by reporters, by fans, even by old friends who thought she carried her loss too lightly. But grief was not always loud. It was not always a wailing thing that demanded to be seen. Sometimes, it was quiet, slipping into the empty spaces of a life once shared, settling into the spaces between words left unsaid. The truth was, she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Loving Carl had always been a lesson in holding on while letting go. He had never wanted the fame, never craved the spotlight. He loved her, but he loved the quiet even more. And so, for decades, she had learned to exist in two worlds, one where the stage called her name, and another where his voice was the only audience she ever needed. A warm breeze carried the distant sound of wind chimes, their familiar melody breaking through her thoughts. She turned her gaze back to the horizon, watching as the sky deepened into a soft pink. In a way, Carl had never truly left her. He was in the rhythm of the rocking chair's creak, in the rustle of the trees, in the way the light danced across the front steps just as it had when he used to wait for her to come home. She picked up her pen, smoothing out the paper beneath her fingers. Words had always been her way of making sense of the world, and this letter deserved an answer. But as she stared at the blank page, she realized there was no perfect way to explain something so boundless. Love, real love, did not end when a heart stopped beating. It stretched beyond time, beyond distance, beyond sorrow. It lived in the moments that once seemed small but now felt like lifelines, the way he used to hum her songs when he thought no one was listening, the way his laughter lingered in the corners of this house, the way she still reached for him in the quiet hours of the night, even when she knew he wouldn't be there. She let out a slow breath, closing her eyes for a moment. Then, with steady hands, she began to write. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. A warm Tennessee afternoon, the scent of fresh-cut hay drifting through the air, and the hum of a lazy summer breeze weaving through the streets of Nashville. Dolly had been just a girl back then, standing outside the wishy-washy laundromat, her arms full of clothes, the weight of her dreams pressing just as heavy against her chest. She hadn't expected to meet anyone that day, let alone someone who would change the course of her life forever. Carldean had been leaning against his truck, his overalls dusted from a day's work, his dark hair slightly tousled from the heat. He wasn't flashy, wasn't the kind of boy who tried to be noticed, but there was something about the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence, the steadiness in his gaze. When their eyes met, there was no grand moment, no thunderclap of fate. Just a simple exchange, a glance that lingered a second longer than necessary, a feeling that settled deep in her bones before she even understood what it meant. He had spoken to her that day, his voice steady, his words simple but certain. And just like that, the world shifted. Their love wasn't built on grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was stitched together in the quiet moments, in the spaces between words, in the laughter that came easy and the silences that felt like home. Carl was never one for crowds, never one to seek the noise of the world, but he had a way of making their little life together feel like the biggest thing in the universe. They spent their days wrapped in simplicity, finding joy in the smallest things. Sunday drives down winding country roads, the truck windows rolled down as the warm breeze tangled in her hair. Morning spent on the front porch, the scent of strong coffee mingling with the crispness of the early light. Inside jokes that made no sense to anyone but them, whispered across the dinner table, sending them into fits of laughter so deep they couldn't catch their breath. Carl had been the kind of man who found happiness in routine. He liked knowing that the sun would rise and set, that the world would keep turning whether or not anyone was watching. And though Dolly's life was anything but routine, filled with flashing cameras, bright lights, and a world that constantly demanded her presence, he never once asked her to change. Instead, he stood firm in the background, the quiet force that kept her steady when the rest of the world spun too fast. There had been nights when the loneliness of fame settled heavy on her shoulders, when the weight of expectations felt unbearable. The roar of the crowd, the relentless flashing of cameras, the exhaustion of being everything to everyone. But Carl had been her anchor, the one thing in her life that remained untouched by the chaos. He never cared for the stage, never wanted the attention. He only cared that she was happy. Through the years, people had often asked her how their love had lasted, how it had withstood the pressure of a world that seemed determined to pull them apart. The truth was, it had never been complicated. Love, real love, didn't need the world's approval. It didn't need to be loud or performative. It just needed to be true. Carl had never needed to stand in the spotlight beside her. He had never needed his name in the headlines or his face on the cover of a magazine. His love for her was quiet, steady, unshakable. And in return, she had loved him just as fiercely, just as deeply, in a way that had nothing to do with the world outside their front door. As she sat on the porch now, her fingers tracing the rim of her tea glass, she could almost hear the echoes of their life together, the soft murmur of his voice on a summer evening, the low rumble of his laughter, the steady sound of his footsteps on the wooden planks. Love had a way of lingering, of leaving traces in the spaces it once filled. And though he was gone, the weight of his presence remained, wrapped around her like the sweetest melody she had ever known. The world had a way of pulling at them, tugging Dolly in one direction while Carl stayed firmly rooted in another. Fame had come like a flood, sweeping her into a life that sparkled under stage lights but often felt lonely in the quiet hours. The road stretched endlessly ahead of her, filled with hotel rooms and concert halls, interviews and rehearsals, nights where the applause faded into a silence that felt heavier than it should. Through it all, Carl remained her constant, steady as the Tennessee hills. He had never asked her to choose between him and the music, never resented the life she had built, even when it meant weeks, sometimes months, spent apart. He understood in a way few men could, that the girl he fell in love with had a fire inside her, one that needed space to burn. He never tried to dim it. Instead, he made sure she knew that no matter how far she traveled, there was always a home waiting for her. There were times when the weight of it all nearly broke her. The pressure to be everything to everyone, to outdo the last success, to hold the world's attention without losing herself in the process. She had questioned if it was worth it, if the dream she had chased since she was a little girl was really what she wanted. The exhaustion had settled deep, making her wonder if she should step away, trade the bright lights for the peace of a quiet life. But Carl had seen her doubt before she even voiced it, had known the fear hidden behind her painted-on smile. He never needed grand speeches to reassure her, just his presence, his quiet belief in her, was enough. She could still picture him, standing in the doorway of their home, arms crossed, watching her with that knowing look. The kind that told her she was stronger than she felt, that she wasn't meant to give up. That he would be there, no matter how many times she needed to leave and come back again. And she always did. No matter how high she climbed, how bright the world shone, she always came home to him. The years passed as gently as they did fiercely, carving lines of laughter and love into their skin, leaving behind memories in the places they had lived and loved. Age softened some things, but not Carl's steady devotion. His love never wavered, never faded under time's touch. He remained the same man he had always been, uncomplicated in his affections, unshaken in his love for her. Even when illness came, creeping in like a shadow, he never let it change who he was. He bore it the way he had always carried life, without complaint, without fear, never asking for more than what the world had already given him. He still teased her in the quiet moments, still held her hand like they were kids again, still made sure she knew that love wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about the way he looked at her across the breakfast table, the way he reached for her hand without thinking, the way he let her go when she needed to chase her dreams, knowing she'd always find her way back. Through every storm, through every season, he had been her shelter. And even now, in the quiet of their home, with only the echoes of their life together filling the empty spaces, she knew his love had never left. It lingered in the worn floorboards, in the wind that rustled through the trees, in the memories that lived in every corner of their world. Love, after all, was never measured by the years spent together, but the day she had to say goodbye to Carl was the kind of day that should have never come. No amount of time together, no matter how rich and full, could make losing him feel right. The house felt different that morning, as if it already knew what was slipping away. The air was still, the world hushed, holding its breath for a love that had been built quietly over decades and now stood on the edge of parting. There had been no dramatic endings, no grand speeches, just the kind of tenderness that had always defined them. His love had never been about words, but about the steady presence, the unwavering certainty that he was there, even in the smallest moments. And now, as she sat beside him for the last time, she knew his love would not fade just because his body did. The days that followed moved in a slow haze. The house, once filled with his presence, felt impossibly large, as if every room had stretched to make space for his absence. The chair he used to sit in remained untouched, the imprint of him lingering in the way the cushions still held their shape. His boots rested by the door, just as he had left them, waiting for steps that would never come. She thought grief would come in waves, crashing in fits of sorrow, but instead, it settled in the quiet moments, the missing weight beside her in bed, the absent sound of his voice in the morning, the way the world felt just a little less steady without him in it. But love, she realized, was not something that left with the body. It remained woven into the fabric of life, showing up in the smallest of ways. The first time she felt it was in the rustling wind that swept across the porch, carrying the scent of honeysuckle, the way it used to when Carl would sit beside her. It was in the red cardinal that landed on the railing, lingering longer than it should, tilting its head in a way that felt oddly familiar. Then there was his favorite song, one that hadn't played on the radio in years, suddenly filling the room when she least expected it. She had been sitting alone, lost in thought, when the first notes drifted through the speakers, wrapping around her like an embrace. She had smiled then, through the tears, whispering a quiet acknowledgement to the love that refused to fade. Music had always been her way of making sense of the world, and Carl had been the quiet muse behind so many of her songs. Now, every note felt like a conversation with him, every lyric carrying his presence in ways she never expected. There were nights when she would sit with her guitar, strumming old melodies, singing not for an audience, but for him. And in those moments, she swore she could feel him there, listening in the spaces between the words. Carl had never truly left. He was in the dreams that still pushed her forward, in the laughter that came unexpectedly, in the wind that danced through the trees. He was in the love that continued to grow, even in his absence. Goodbye had never been in their nature. Not when she left for the road, not when life pulled them in different directions, and not even now. Love, the kind they had built, was too strong for such things. It was not bound by time, not limited to the years they had shared. It stretched beyond the boundaries of life and death, lingering in the places where the heart still remembered. And so, she carried him with her. In every step, in every song, in every quiet moment where the wind whispered his name. Love had not ended. It had only changed shape. The house was quiet in a way that felt different now. Not empty, not lonely, just still. The kind of stillness that wasn't hollow but full, filled with memories, laughter, and the kind of love that had never needed to be loud to be real. It lingered in the walls, in the porch swing that moved ever so slightly when the wind picked up, in the scent of his aftershave that still clung to the fabric of his old shirts folded neatly in the dresser. Dolly sat in their favorite spot on the porch, a worn notebook open on her lap, a pen resting loosely in her fingers. The night stretched out before her, dark and endless, the sky littered with stars that winked down like old friends. The cicadas hummed their usual chorus, the Tennessee air thick with the scent of magnolia, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called out into the darkness. It had taken her time to find the words. Not because they weren't there, oh, they were always there, but because this song wasn't meant for the world. It wasn't meant for the stage or the radio or the hands of strangers. It was just for him. A quiet love letter to the man who had given her a forever that stretched beyond the limits of time. She traced the first lines she had written, simple and unpolished, raw in a way that her songs rarely were. This one had no need for perfection. It wasn't for charts or critics, just for the man who had loved her when she was still a girl with big dreams and a bigger heart. The man who had stayed steady while the world tried to pull her away, who had never once asked for more than her love in return. Her fingers found the familiar curves of her guitar, the wood worn soft from years of playing. She strummed gently, a melody forming as naturally as a breath. It was slow and sweet, the kind of song that wasn't made to be performed but to be felt. The kind of song that belonged to the quiet moments, the ones they had always cherished most. As she sang, her voice barely above a whisper, the night seemed to lean in closer, as if listening. The wind stirred, carrying the melody beyond the porch, beyond the hills, beyond the world she could see. And she imagined, just for a moment, that it reached him, wherever he was. Carl had always told her that love wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the little things, the everyday moments, the spaces in between. And now she understood more than ever, love wasn't something that faded with time or distance. It wasn't something that could be undone by loss. It remained, waiting in the quiet, in the memories, in the songs sung into the night. She let the final note linger, her eyes drifting to the stars above. There was no sadness in her heart, not anymore. The grief, once heavy, had softened into something else, something beautiful. Because grief was never really an ending. It was just love with nowhere to go, waiting to be turned into something new. And so, she sang. For Carl. For the love they had built. For the forever they still shared.